Greetings, happy warriors, and welcome to the Rabbi Daniel Lapin Show, where I, your rabbi, reveal how the world really works. Thanks for being part of the show, you happy warriors. We happy warriors are people who joyfully confront our challenges and competently overcome them. And so it is a pleasure and a privilege to be one of your number as we continue exploring how the world, yes, really works. There is a character in the 4th chapter of the book of Genesis around whom a certain amount of confusion exists. His name is Lemech, and he shows up in chapter 4 of Genesis, about verse 20, somewhere there. And this guy, Lemech, there's a lot of mystery about him, which I explain in my Scrolling Through Scripture series, but I won't go into the part now where he speaks about revenge, about Cain, and all that confusion. But I will mention that he is the only name in Genesis that is repeated for two separate people. In other words, there's only one Adam, and there's only one Jacob, and there's only one everybody else. But Lemech shows up twice. He shows up once, as here I'm telling you, in chapter 4 of Genesis, round about verse 20, and he also shows up at the end of chapter 5. Different guy, same name. Over there, he is the father of Noah. And it goes without saying that there is some very interesting ancient Jewish wisdom to explain why this guy is the same name as that guy who was Noah's father. But this guy, we hear, took for himself 2 wives. And the name of one was Ada, and the name of the other was Tzila. And ancient Jewish wisdom mentions that he's the first guy to take 2 wives. And why 2 wives? One of them was for erotic pleasure, and the other was for reproduction. And by the way, discussion about the birth control techniques he used in order to make sure that the wife whose purpose was sexual pleasure would not, in fact, get pregnant. All very interesting, right? This is all old information. Nonetheless, interestingly enough, by verse 23 or thereabouts, turns out that both wives had given birth, from which we discover that most women do have a deep-seated desire for children, not when they are 18 necessarily, and not when they're 23, but by the late 20s and into the 30s, women do develop a deep biological urge to have a child. There's a name for it. The women's magazines call it baby hunger, and it's quite a well-known phenomenon, which is why that when the current culture in the United States of America wants to promote sterilization of women, they encourage very young women to do it, because women who are late 20s or into their 30s are very often desperately trying to become pregnant. They're not about to do themselves a mutilation. And so it is, in fact, younger women they get to do it. And interestingly enough, they get doctors to do this. Now, doctors have suddenly started becoming a little bit skittish about it, simply because there have been a number of instances of women having deep and profound regrets a few years later and trying to sue doctors. They cover themselves very well, and I think they're pretty sue-proof in these situations. But that's what they do, and And there are a number of young women who have, in fact, amazingly enough, made themselves permanently sterile. It's pretty amazing. And when you hear them speak, they very often come up retroactively with justifications. For example, and I'm just going through some of this right now, Isabel says, I think it's morally wrong to bring a child into the world. She had the operation. I'm just looking to see that. Here's Darlene in Denver, and she had her tubes removed surgically. My generation is very aware of the ways that our parents traumatized us. Really? My mom smoked a lot of weed and did her own thing, and my dad was away a lot for work. She says her parents' marriage improved after they became empty nesters. She set out to get sterilized at the age of 21, and she said she just doesn't want children. She doesn't think she'll ever want children. There's a whole group, by the way, on the internet. There's a whole group of women who either have become sterilized or are planning it or thinking about it, and they all encourage each other about this. And on a number of dating apps, there's actually now a place where you can actually say, I don't want to have children. And so they call themselves child-free, and that way they can, and I'm taking this from the website of one of these dating communities. This way, you pay slightly more to be able to list yourself as child-free, but that will eliminate future breeders from your feed. Okay. They also call themselves thinkers. In other words, when they get married to somebody who also doesn't want children. And, it goes without saying that somebody who thinks they know what they want at 24 or 25 doesn't necessarily at all know what they want when they hit 45 or 50. Anyway, that goes without saying. But they call themselves thinkers. Thinkers, right? Two stands for THINKERS, two high incomes, no kids, early retirement. Sophia, 19 years old, is being sterilized right now, and she said she had a good relationship with her parents, no problem at all. Her parents are religious Christians, and the whole family believes they're kid-friendly, but she isn't. She's left the church behind. She felt it had a toxic culture, but she describes herself as vaguely spiritual, and she says she knows she doesn't ever want kids. I'm going to do the surgery thing once, rest for a few days, and never think about it again. I don't think that's going to work out too well. I guarantee you she will think about it again many times. For heaven's sake, she's 19 years old. She's found a doctor who will sterilize her. This is amazing. Chelsea in Sacramento. Kids gross me out. She says she is going to be having sterilization surgery. She says, what's there to regret? That I'll be too happy or too free? And this is, it's an interesting thing. How widespread it is, I don't know, but I do know that it's being spoken about. And there are articles about it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a very large trend, but it is out there in a way that's really very, very strange. This idea of the tension between sex and reproduction is very real. And it's one that I think we ought to talk about for a little bit, don't you? Because the as you can imagine, I mean, all human beings are incredibly aware that there is this tension. On the one hand, how can something that brings the highest sensual pleasure for human beings possibly be good and virtuous and holy? Because just pleasure, surely all of our religious and moral understanding is that part of becoming a good person is you defer gratification. You're not driven by sensual and physical pleasure. I'm sure, would you not agree with me that one measure of the quality of a human being is the extent to which they are capable of short-term sacrifice for long-term gain, right? And when you think about it, that's really the definition of having children, don't you think? Short-term sacrifice, yeah. And especially when they're very little and there's sleepless nights and getting used to so many new things. Yeah, short-term sacrifice for long-term benefits. But right now, we are seeing a trend in the West, and I think this is less so on the continent of Africa, but in Europe and North America, we are discovering a drop in marriages, a drop in fertility, and there are some countries, like Korea, for instance, where last year, for the first time, there were more deaths recorded than births. There are actually some states in the United States of America where that is happening. So here we've got a decline in having and raising children. And I should mention that in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, seems like it's a Bible-centric podcast today, but the reason is because it's important to understand that the Bible is descriptive, not proscriptive. Or should I say maybe prescriptive is a better way of putting it. The Bible is descriptive, not prescriptive, in the sense that that the law of gravity is descriptive, not prescriptive. It's not as if, Englishmen could float around the countryside in untethered helium balloons in the 1600s, because Newton hadn't yet declared the law of gravitation. But then, all of a sudden, Isaac Newton stated the law of gravitation, and now all Englishmen had to stay rooted to the ground with their feet firmly on the earth. No, his law didn't prescribe, it didn't set the law, it described the law. People were always stuck to the earth. Newton explained the nature of that force that we call gravity. And that is how it is as well. When the Bible speaks about a linkage between money and marriage, that is real. When the Bible speaks about a man initiating marriage, that's not a law. You don't get God angry if you have a woman initiating a marriage, good luck to her. No, it's describing the reality that even after 60 years of aggressive feminist egalitarianism, when you would have thought that by now 50% of the marriages you hear about, 50% of the marriages that are going to take place this coming spring, are marriages that were set in motion because the woman got down on one knee and proposed to the guy, and 50% of them are going to come about because the guy got down on one knee and proposed to the woman. But it isn't like that. When the Bible says that a man initiates the marriage, it's not prescribing a law, it's describing a reality. And so it is with everything that we're discussing now. The story of Lemech and his two wives, one for erotic pleasure and one for pregnancy, one for reproduction, and he didn't want her figure, the one who was for pleasure, he didn't want her figure to be impacted by pregnancy, so he kept her sterile. And in the end, her desire for a baby overrode all of that, and she did, in fact, decide to and made sure she did have a baby. But going back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God has created human beings, and God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the land. Be fruitful and multiply. Let me tell you a general rule in understanding the Bible, and that is poetic formulations are probably wrong translations, because the Bible is not supposed to be poetry. It is a guide to how the world really works. That's what it is. And so when it says, be fruitful and multiply, can you tell me, what does the word multiply add to the word fruitful, and what does the word fruitful add to the word multiply? They both mean have kids. And so what's really going on? The correct translation of the Hebrew, be fruitful and multiply, the Hebrew is pru uravu, and what that really means is have children, be fruitful, and raise them properly. This is very important, because in order for society to function, you've got to have growing population. It's just a reality. For society to thrive, I should say, you've got to have a growing population. But it's got to be a population of people that are part of a common system. They have to have shared values. Otherwise, it's a destructive situation. And so since we are now watching in the United States of America, and figures are not that different elsewhere in the West, the number of children born in 2023 who will not know their fathers is over 40%. I'm not sure exactly how much over 40%, but it is over 40%. There's some confusion about how much more. But that means 4 out of 10 children are going to be born this year who will never know their fathers. Now, is there any way that those children can grow up to be participating, law-abiding, productive citizens? Yeah, it's possible. What do you think the chances are? And I'll leave you to think that through. But important to understand. And so when European countries like France, Germany, and Sweden, and Italy recognized that their populations are stagnant, and they had a real problem because they've got all those countries have extremely lavish welfare programs, so-called social nets. There's got to be a growing population of younger people, otherwise it can't be sustained, right? You can see what the problem is. What happens is it doesn't take long before people needing social welfare exceed the number of people providing it to such an extent that the system implodes. It can't work. And so many European countries try to solve the problem by bringing in young males from Middle East and North Africa, and they've discovered, to their deep dismay, that it isn't working. Viktor Orban in Hungary, and Viktor Orban, in my view, is an excellent leader for his country. I know he's very unpopular with the left, both in Europe and in America, and to his credit, he could not care less. And he said, look, we don't think bringing in migrants is the solution. We want more Hungarians, not just more people, and he could not be more correct. And so what he has set about to do is to encourage Hungarian families to be formed and to have children. He's encouraging marriages with financial incentive. He's encouraging the birth of children because he realizes that this is absolutely essential. And this is hilarious because so many people on the left for 50, 60 years already have been absolutely obsessed with the idea that there are too many human beings. And now they're being dragged kicking and screaming to the factual reality, which is that most Western countries have a very serious problem of vanishing human beings. But it's not just places like Hungary. Korea has been trying. And now, if you please, Texas has a bill that's under consideration that would give huge tax breaks to big families, provided mother and father are married, provided the children are born after they are married, and if a family has 4 or more children, they pay a very diminished property tax. They pay 60% instead of 100% property tax. If they have 5 kids, they get a 50% reduction. 6 children, 60. How about 10 children? I actually know a few people with 10 children. In Texas, they would pay 0 property taxes at all. All right, that's probably a wise policy. Probably a wise policy, because when you think about it, it is society that needs more children. If you are living in a country and maybe you're raising children in that country and you one day would like your grandchildren to be able to live in that country, you want to make sure there are a lot of other people as well, because otherwise the tax burden on your grandchildren will be unsustainable eventually. You want there to be other, because that's how society will thrive and flourish. So it makes sense then for society to help couples, families raise children, because otherwise what you really are saying is, hey, parents, you got to bear the whole cost of raising these young people who ultimately will become vital assets to the state. Okay, yeah. So the general rule is that you incentivize with finance the kind of behavior you want in a society. And so there used to be a way of giving people a significant tax reduction if they were married. A man and a woman married to one another would pay far less in taxes than if they were single. And if they had children, anyway, little by little, a lot of the stuff's being eroded in most countries. But it does make sense in terms of what a society needs to do to make sure. But it isn't happening. Meanwhile, the reality is that fertility is dropping in most industrialized countries. So back to the enigma. How can an activity that produces sensual pleasure in the extreme, how can that be holy? How can that be good? How can that be virtuous? Given that somehow or another embedded within us is, people sometimes dismiss, oh, that's just puritanical thinking. But it's actually a lot deeper than that. This idea that as good people, we sacrifice short-term gain for short-term gratification or pleasure for long-term benefit. And so now, obviously, it leaves us feeling a little bit guilty. And it's one of the reasons there is a very natural awkwardness about physical intimacy between a man and a woman, because there's a part of us that feels, gosh, it's too pleasurable. We shouldn't be doing that thing. We were put here on this planet for serious things. Why? What is that all about? So there's a part of us saying, how can this activity possibly be a good, holy, virtuous, wonderful thing, since it is a source of pleasure? But then on the other hand, we also say, but wait a second, this is the source of human life. This is the ultimate affirmation of life. and anybody who has engaged in it feels that and recognizes it and knows it. And so how can something that brings life into the world be anything but virtuous and good and holy? And so we're left with this strange dichotomy, a tension, as it were, between sex and reproduction. On the one end of the spectrum is the idea that sex is only for erotic pleasure and reproduction is an accidental and undesirable outcome. Now, I mean, I know that sounds crazy, but that's really how a large part of Western society thinks, particularly men. And so what you have in parts of society, whether it's in the United Kingdom or the United States, and many, many other places as well, it's just that I personally know and understand the United Kingdom and the United States better than I do most other places. And that is it's what happens. Reproduction ends up being women without men. Yeah, I mean, obviously a man helps for about 30 seconds, but female-led households, single motherhood, growing everywhere in the West, because on the surface of it, men intuitively think that the purpose of sex is erotic pleasure, and to the extent that it could produce reproduction, that's an accident, and it's undesirable, and we can take steps to avoid it. And sure enough, society, the country, the government, goes along with that notion. Incredibly short-sighted and incredibly stupid, but they do. So, for instance, in January 2023, Joe Biden's Food and Drug Administration lifted restrictions that prevented patients from obtaining medication abortion pills by mail. Just order them, get them, and take them at home. It's pretty extraordinary. So everything is being done by a sick culture to make sure that the tension between sex and reproduction is resolved primarily at the end of the spectrum that says the main purpose of sex is erotic pleasure between a man and a woman, and reproduction is to be avoided to whatever extent possible. So, not surprisingly, America's fertility rate has been plummeting. It's not that long ago we were comfortably above replacement rate at 2.1, and America's now somewhere 1.6, 1.7 and dropping. So, I mean, that's pretty amazing, by the way. This particular drug, all right, it's called Mifepristone and misoprostol. You have to take both of these drugs, and these have been available for since about 2000, the year 2000, but it was always said, both on the FDA side and on the medication packaging, this has to be administered by a doctor in a clinic setting. Why? Well, because think about it. First of all, at a certain point, it becomes unsafe. The danger of a life-threatening hemorrhage is very real, and so a doctor should be on hand to make sure that the baby is not beyond a certain level of gestation. I mean, these are sad things, but that's the reality. So now this has been changed, and even young girls, teenage girls who are not even 18, can get hold of this and use it at home without any supervision. Right now, I'll tell you, there's another interesting biblical reference which actually shows up many, many, many times, and this one has to do with a warning not to sacrifice your children to the god of Molech and the god of Baal Peor. And again, what's descriptive rather than prescriptive? God is saying, hey, you are going to end up doing this, and you must stop it. You mustn't do it. What is it talking about? The fact that as a society deteriorates, one of the things that happens is that children are seen increasingly as a burden and as an obstacle to the goals and desires of parents, and very often not married parents. And so sure enough, one of the things that happens is children are somewhat abandoned, whether they are latchkey children or whether they're just sent off on the yellow school bus with the notion that, let the state take care of my children, whether these children are encouraged to go into physical mutilation in the name of gender transforming. It's one thing after another. Obviously, nobody actually cares about the children. This is all for political and personal gratification. And these things happen, even encouraging 19-year-old girls to have sterilization procedures that are permanent. All of these things are sacrificing our children, letting our boys roam the streets, become delinquent, and after that become criminal, and after that ending up in the criminal justice system, very often killed during these criminal activities. And this is, who has it roughest in the United States right now? It's children, I think. And this is also true in the United Kingdom. And so, yes, we are putting our children through these extraordinary sacrifices. What sacrificing to the god of Molech and Baal Peor mean is actually very close to exactly what it is that is happening in American society right now. It's prophetic to the extreme. And but I'll go to something which is really lovely, and that is that Mrs. Lapin, a little while ago, did a video program of bread making. Not only regular bread, but special Sabbath bread called challah. And I got to tell you, there's something deeply satisfying about baking bread. It's quite different from, making a soup or cooking up a stew. All of that's satisfying for people who enjoy it as well, and it's satisfying to eat. But making your own bread, now that's different. And there is a reason that when residential realtors are showing houses, one of the things they try to do is have bread baking in the oven, because the smell of freshly baked bread wafting around a house just creates such a good atmosphere. It's a buying mood that is set up. And it's easier than you'd think. You just got to know how to do it. And so Susan Lapin goes ahead and does a terrific depiction. You see exactly the ingredients, how she mixes them, how long everything takes, what she uses, how she kneads them, how she lets it rise, how she bakes it, how she even shapes it to look like special Shabbat bread. It has braids on it as well. So anyway, all of this is on sale on our website right now. So all you got to go do is go to rabbidaniellapin.com. And you can either search for challah, C-H-A-L-L-A-H, challah, C-H-A-L-L-A-H, or just go into the store at rabbidaniellapin.com and look for videos. And there under videos, you'll see Susan Lapin bakes challah. And you'll love it. It's I think it's on special sale now for like $10. Maybe $11, something like that. It's way down, and it's an easy acquisition, and it'll bring you much pleasure. And needless to say, it helps to support this show, make sure that we can keep on producing this podcast every week. So head over there and do yourself a favor and do us a favor and start baking challah. It becomes addictive after a while. First of all, you love having fresh baked bread in the house. Number two, the quality of fresh baked bread is so different from commercially baked bread, unless you have an artisan bakery in your neighborhood. But other than that, bakery that you get through your grocery store, bread you get through the grocery store, of necessity has preservatives and chemicals in it, none of which go into challah when you bake it yourself, just the way Mrs. Lapin will show you. So please do that and let me know how you enjoy it. I think you're going to love it. So there we are. In order to keep society at the end of the spectrum that says sex is primarily about erotic pleasure and, let's forget the reproduction aspect. And so, not surprisingly, societies that have moved in this direction have, not surprisingly, moved into negative population growth with all the problems that brings as well. But that's not all. It's kind of interesting. A couple of things I'm going to tell you about, and I'll be as discreet as I can, but these are just things that you don't ordinarily hear about. And we know already from the COVID calamity that any time a narrative did not fit with the one being promoted by the government and the culture, it was suppressed and you never heard it. And so even though now it's becoming clear that the COVID epidemic began at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, you still don't hear that so much, although increasingly we do. And we have to remember that everybody who suggested that at the beginning, I mean, my goodness, we know it started in Wuhan. Wuhan is the home to one of the world's biggest virology institutes that was carrying out experiments on the COVID virus, many of which were funded by Anthony Fauci in the United States. And shocker, if anybody suggested that it was a failure of the god of science and that it was from the virology lab in Wuhan that the whole thing spread by a horrible accident at best, you weren't allowed to say that. And so I'll tell you a couple of things now, which are also not spoken about a whole lot. And I tell them to you like I tell you everything, not because I expect you to take them on face value or just because I say so, but at least to just let you know about the existence of these ideas. And, if you're interested, you will investigate further all by yourself. Suffice it to say that in ancient Jewish wisdom, the condom is not an approved form of birth control. Why is that? Well, for two reasons. One is that there has to be complete skin-to-skin contact for the full emotional and romantic bonding to take place, and that's a requirement, and it's the way God created us, and it is best done in a way that allows complete skin-to-skin contact everywhere, which is prevented by that particular latex product. So what is acceptable or what works? The other reason is also very interesting, and that is that the material carrying the seed, the material carrying the sperm, is actually a positive thing for women. And it so happens that in the female reproductive apparatus, the capacity to absorb into the body from there is very strong. And so in a certain way, male seed or semen is a sort of a wonder drug. It actually decreases a woman's risk of preeclampsia. It suppresses uterine immune response. It reduces uterine inflammation. It helps with hormone balancing, and it helps to make pregnancies last, to endure. And that's not all. There are other things as well. I don't want to go into the whole medical or any other aspect of it now, but just to say, you may never have heard of this. It's possible you've never heard that the material that is carried into the female body through the act of intimacy is actually a very big positive for women. It is also a mood enhancer. It creates happiness. Interesting. All of that, which is prevented by the device I initially mentioned. However, there are other devices that allow the male seed into the body, but not all the way to the womb. That is acceptable. And then, of course, there is chemical prevention as well. Now, what chemical prevention does is essentially make it impossible for ovulation to take place. And obviously, if there's no ovulation, then there is no pregnancy. And you say, okay, well, that sounds good. The only trouble is that these hormone adjustments to the female body, well, let's put it this way, a lot of women end up feeling that they don't like what's happening. And although I believe last year over 90 million prescriptions for birth control pills were issued, many, many women are going off it because of the concern of what this is doing to their bodies. Again, these are things everyone decides in conjunction with their own medical advisors, but men tend to think the pill is this sort of magical panacea that all of a sudden authorized us to unrestrained sexuality. And it's not so simple. A lot of women and their doctors are not altogether comfortable with what the birth control pill does to the human body. There's something else that goes on as well, by the way. Very, very interesting. And the full long-term consequences of this one are not well known yet at all. But we know that there are certain changes that take place in a woman during this miraculous period of ovulation. And in terms of how they feel and even how they look. And the attractiveness varies. And these things are fairly well known, but what isn't quite so well known is that there may be a subtle process of natural selection going on. And what I mean by that is that it used to be that subtly and subconsciously, we men were drawn to women during the ovulation days. We felt the strongest attraction, and we adjusted for that. But today, large numbers of women are never ovulating because they're on the pill for extended periods of time. And so many, many, many more men are now not around women who ovulate at all. Interesting changes. Think about it. I might give more detailed explanations another time. But this is all part of this incredible tension between sex and reproduction. What's going on? So, what is the other end of the spectrum? The other end of the spectrum is that sex is mainly for reproduction. That's the main thing, and any other aspect of it is really questionable. And I don't think there are many people who subscribe to that view. I mean, I have met a few who've spoken to me about this and who really do believe that God wants them to just focus on reproduction and to minimize any pleasurable bonding in the entire process. Okay, fine. But those are the two extremes. Sex is all about reproduction. No, sex is all about erotic pleasure. That's all it is. What is the reality? The reality is the truth, that it's both. Obviously, it's not only for reproduction, because if that were so, there would be religious prohibitions against having intimate relations with a woman who, shall we say, is pregnant. So there can be no reproductive purpose in that act. Nothing could be further from the truth. And so it's perfectly clear that this is a process that God built into human beings to bring about the kind of marital bonding that he wanted us to have. And I would go a bit further as well and say that it also has an educational process. Because if you think about a teenage boy, an adolescent boy, right? And to him, the notion that there are other people who want certain things, other people with preferences and wishes, gosh, aren't most adolescent males utterly indifferent to other people's wishes? It's a hugely challenging educational process for parents to be able to get their sons to a point where they are aware and sensitive to other people's needs. It's hard work. Now, it's incredible when you succeed. It's remarkable. It's the most amazing parental satisfaction. But it isn't easy. But you are helped when all of a sudden, at a certain age, he meets a girl, or he encounters a girl at church or at youth group or whatever it is, and he really likes her. And all of a sudden, he is overcome by a desire to please her, which is extraordinary. Even young boys have that. Where he'll want to, get her flowers or get her a gift. This desire on the part of a man to please a woman is hugely important, and it has a lot to do with socializing and civilizing males. Obviously, it requires the woman to behave like a woman and to learn what being feminine means, because that is what enhances this instinct in men. And his parents, all of a sudden, for the first time, encounter this boy, I don't know, 18, 19, 20, whatever he is, who they hear him saying to a girl, well, what would you like to do? And they think to themselves, it's remarkable. In the last 18 years, they've never, ever heard him ask anybody else what they like. And yet this incredible feat of civilizational expertise has been accomplished by this young slip of a girl. And she's managed to get him to be interested in her wishes. This is really important because he enjoys doing that. And what's more, that carries forward to the marital relationship, where this continuing idea of bringing pleasure to the woman is this amazing experience. Well, if you think about it from God's point of view, what is a better preparation for having a child? What better preparation could there be for the lesson, this vitally important lesson, which is caring for another person more than one cares for oneself, is the greatest pleasure. And you're about 9 months away from having with you a new little person who for the next 16 years you're going to have to take care of. And it's really good because you've had this great lesson, even in the very act of conception. You've had this great lesson that says, you know what? Taking care of another person is the greatest thrill of all. It's a wonderful thing. And that really is the secret Is sex about reproduction or erotic pleasure? The answer is yes, it's both. And even if there's not going to be a pregnancy and there is no reproduction, the educational benefit of it, the idea of particularly a man becoming civilized through this process, is fundamental to the preservation of civilization. And needless to say, the reproductive aspect is also fundamental to the survival of civilization. All of those things go together. And so, yeah, it's not really a dichotomy. It is holy because it is the source of life, and it is holy because it brings about God's model for male-female bonding called marriage. And yes, it also it has to do with reproduction. It's what brings new life into the world and makes it possible for societies to continue. So it's tough stuff to think about, just because what do you say to a man, right? There are many, many, many men in Western society today who believe exclusively that physical intimacy is only about erotic pleasure. They don't even stay around for the birth of the child. They certainly don't marry the woman. So they really show that their belief system is entirely just about erotic pleasure, and it is left for the women to bring up the children. That's what happens, as best as they possibly can. Well, this is not a simple matter, because what do you say to a man? Let's say one of these men comes to you and says, hey, I've heard that you don't agree with me. I am positive that sex is only about erotic pleasure. I couldn't care less about reproduction. As a matter of fact, I'd just assume that never happens. And I heard you don't agree with me. Could you tell me what's wrong with my thinking? Well, it's difficult, isn't it? What are you going to say to that person? I should wait for a second here for you to think about it. What are you going to say to that person? Are you going to say, well, if we don't have more people, then society's going to wind down, because if we don't have more people operating and working and paying taxes, then nothing's going to be possible. He says, look, leave me alone. I really couldn't care less. And in fact, some of them will say, yeah, you're talking about years and years into the future after I'm probably no longer around. Who cares? I'm not interested. What do you say to a person? And if you think about this, you'll see how incredibly difficult it is to come up with any answer as to why taking that approach to sex is wrong and destructive, not just to the future of society, but even to the man himself. And it's difficult because a man who is already at the point where he is absolutely convinced that sex is only about erotic pleasure and has nothing to do with reproduction, it's going to be very difficult to say to him, look, deep down, you may not even sense it, but think about it, you desire immortality. In a certain way, you would like to live forever. Now, that in its simplest form isn't possible, but you will be astonished how close you can get to it through the miracle of raising children. That's a hard thing to describe to somebody. It's a very, very hard thing to describe. But that's kind of where it's got to go. It goes a little bit further as well, in the sense that through the 5F blueprint, your family, your friendships, your faith, your fitness, and your finances, those linkages are real. Family, meaning children, among other things, very much contributing to friendship, very much contributing to finances. And again, these are, for people whose attention span lasts as long as a television commercial, it is very hard. Right? The concepts I've been imparting to you on today's show, I couldn't do in a 30-second soundbite. It's not possible. But the trouble is that we have created a society where very large numbers of men particularly have extremely short attention spans. And that automatically makes it impossible for them to understand certain concepts, certain ideas, and certain linkages. And the value of having children in your life is one of those things that is not a 30-second discussion or a 30-second explanation. But it is important. And happy warriors, who obviously all have much longer attention spans than 30 seconds, happy warriors understand that regardless of what's going on, regardless of whatever challenges you might encounter, everything is better if your 5 F's are in good shape. And the F of family isn't just about the sexual act that makes family come into existence, but it is actually about the family it produces as well, the children that then arrive. And it's important. This is really a topic for another show, but I will at least mention it now, and that is that the only way that a man can have children is through a dedicated wife. Gentlemen, it's a wonderful thing to have children, but the only way you'll have children is if your wife wants you to. Oh, it may be possible that she becomes pregnant and she has children and they come to you for pocket money and allowance and they call you daddy. But for them to really, really be your children and to give you the deepest sense of immortality satisfaction, that only comes from a wife who wants that to be the case. Worth thinking about. Have a look at making challah, because another thing that's life-affirming in a different kind of way is baking bread. It really is. It is, after all, symbolic in our culture of life and sustenance. So go ahead and get a copy of the download, the video of how to, or if you wanted to come in a package, it can as well. And you will have the recipe, and you'll be able to watch the process, and you'll be able to do everything except smell and taste the result, because for the smell and the taste of the result, you're going to have to do it yourself. And that's going to be really easy to do. You go to RabbiDanielLapin.com and search for the video, Making Challah, and away you go. You'll love it. And away you go on the forthcoming week, which I hope will be a week for you, of moving onwards and upwards in your faith, in your family, in your finances, in your fitness, and in your friendships. I'm Rabbi Daniel Lapin. God bless.